Most men don't fail loudly. They just stop noticing the gap between who they said they'd be and who they became. This is where that gap gets named. This is the Revolutionary Man. In our last episode, we named what was closed. It was 3 windows, a fixed cost, and completely irreversible. Not because it was the loudest episode, but because it named things that don't change when you decide differently tomorrow. In this episode, we're going to focus on something different. It's about what's still here. And not talking about it from a comfort perspective, but as an equation, as this equation's being built over all of these episodes. And not because it's still available, because what's still available isn't sitting still. It's in motion. It's quiet, without drama and without any announcements. And so the equation of a moving window is simple. The distance between now and closed is not fixed, because every day is a measurement. And today's reading is going to be different from tomorrow's. And what makes this harder to sit with than our previous episode is that the previous episode was all about what you can no longer change. So that in itself does carry weight. But it's a bit of a finality. And so this is about what you can still change, which means the cost of what comes next is still undecided by what you do with the time you're in the moment. Now that's a different kind of pressure, a different kind of accounting from what's already been settled, isn't it? What's still accessible and how fast it's closing, that's what this episode is about. So let's name what's still here. Your children are at their current ages, and whatever was unavailable at ages has now passed. Well, we covered that already in our previous episode. What's available at the ages they are today is still on the table, and the access with a 12-year-old is different from what existed at 7. The questions that we're sitting with now are things that they're navigating. It's those moments where a present father matters in ways that specify this current season. That access, that's on the table and in play. It's not guaranteed in the same form that it was 5 years ago, but it is here now. And the version of your marriage, well, that is still workable as well. And it's not the version before the drift that became your architecture, because we touched on that as well in the last episode, because we know that that has been settled. Because the marriage that exists today with the 2 people you both actually are is carrying what you're both carrying. Something real still remains in that place. The capacity for a different kind of conversation than the ones that you've been having. The possibility of a different operating mode rather than the one that has been calcified into our default actions. That possibility exists today in a way it won't if the current direction continues unedited for another 5 years. And the window to be the man who changed, well, it still mattered. See, there is a version of this story where a man sees the full cost. What's been transmitted, what's been foreclosed, what's still being accumulated, and moves while the people closest to him are still present enough, still open enough for it to register. That version, that person of who you are, is still available. Just not indefinitely, just today. What's generally still here, that won't be in the same form if things simply continue as they have been. And here's what you have to look at to access this accurately. Not where the opening is, the speed at which it is closing. How fast and in what direction, and what does that speed produce in 1 year, 3 years, and 5? That's not predicting the future. That's a reading of what's happening now, visible from the direction that's already being established. Not the direction that you intend, the one your behavior has been describing. See, your children's availability isn't fixed, is it? The ages they are now, they're still in proximity, still in the house, or recently enough out of it that the relationship has some texture. But that season has a closing date, and it's not going to be announced. It's biological. The shift from proximity to independence runs on its own schedule, outside of your own control. And so the question that shifts answers is simple. At the current level of your engagement, what does the relationships look like when the proximity ends? Now think about it. It's not about what you hope, what the direction produces, your marriage's capacity for change, isn't going to be fixed either. Drift will compound, and the longer a distance has been in the default, the more embedded it becomes. So it's harder to shift next year than this year, and harder still the year after that. That opening that was available today is wider than will exist in 3 years if nothing changes. You already understand this compounding. We've been talking about it for several episodes. The cost of a corrective action applied is always lower than the same action applied later on. And every year of accumulated distance is a year that correction has to work against. So the math doesn't pause while you're waiting to decide. The window to be the man who changed while it's still registered isn't going to be fixed either. Right now, it carries the credibility of a man who moved before the full cost is settled, before the people closest to him had fully recalibrated their expectations downward to match what he consistently has provided. That recalibration happens quietly, over time, and in the same way that the drift did. And once it's complete, changing is still possible, but what it lands on is going to be different. You're not just closing a gap. You're working against what people have already adjusted to expect. That credibility has its own closing date. So what does the current correction produce if it simply continues for 3 more years? And so here's the distinction between what this episode is doing and what a warning does. A warning says, if you keep going, this will happen. This is completely different. The gap is accumulating now, not in a future scenario, but in the present. And while you're listening, while you're sitting with everything that this act has named, it doesn't pause while you deliberate. It just keeps building at a rate that it's been building. What's already settled carries that fixed cost. That number doesn't move. What's still accessible carries a running cost. The figure is different today from 6 months ago and different again 6 months from now. The cost of what remains isn't what's already been paid. It's the rate of what's being paid now multiplied by however long the current direction continues. And it's that multiplication that makes this the most actionable thing in this entire act. Not because it offers us hope, because it's the only part of the accounting that hasn't been written. What is the accumulated cost of what's still accessible? And what does the speed of change tell you about how long it stays that way? Here's where most of the men in your position stall. And it's worth naming precisely because it's where this entire act can lose its effect. They understand the cost. They can describe their ledger completely. They could walk you through everything this act has covered. The transmission, the chapter still being written, the settled accounts, the one still accumulating. The understanding is truly genuine, but understanding a cost and accepting responsibility for it is not the same position. Understanding says, I see what this has cost. Responsibility says, I'm the one who determines what it costs from here. And one is a realization, the other is a decision. And the decision isn't made in a single moment of clarity. It's made in the hour after this episode ends. In whether you set it down and step back onto the path exactly where you left it, moved perhaps, but unchanged in what is actually happening next. Or whether something about the way you move through the rest of this day is measurably different. It may not be dramatically, but measurably. High-performing man knows the difference between genuine commitment and a sentiment that dissolves on contact with the demands of the day. He's made both kinds of decisions. He knows what real commitment feels like when it forms, the way it reorganizes what gets his attention, not just his intention. This is the moment that distinction matters more than it has at any point of this season, because the gap between understanding and deciding is precisely where the capable men spend years. They understand completely. They decide almost never. And what's still accessible just keeps closing. And one more thing worth naming before we close this act. The decision that Act 4 points towards is not one a man makes well alone, not because he lacks capacity, because the same conditions that produce the gap, the privacy, the self-sufficiency, the absence of anyone standing close enough to hold him to a different standard, are the exact conditions that will absorb a private decision and dissolve it. A man who decides to close the gap using only internal resources that allowed it to open is making a category error. The gap didn't form because he lacked intelligence or motivation. It formed because nothing in his environment held him to a different standard. Changing the outcome requires changing the environment, not just the intention. So here is the full accounting as a single finding. What was transmitted across years without knowing it was being transmitted. What's being transmitted now while the record is still running. What's settled while you were planning to get it, and what's still accessible and still in motion. 4 ledgers, all running simultaneously the entire time this gap has been running. And the single finding they add up to, the gap has never been free. It has always carried a cost on multiple accounts, without pause, without waiting for acknowledgement from continuing to accumulate. You didn't have the full picture until now. That was what Act 3's job was. Picture, it's complete now, which means from here, every day is a day that you're choosing the direction with full awareness of what it produces. Not accidentally and not through drift, with a ledger open right in front of you. A man who continues after seeing this clearly is making a different kind of choice than a man who simply hasn't looked at it. And a man who decides to move after seeing it clearly is doing something that wasn't available to him before he did. That decision and what it actually requires is what this act has been all about. It's not about more cost. You already know what the cost is. What comes next is the reckoning with what a man does when understanding has become responsibility. And when he has the full picture, open eyes and nothing left to explain away, the opening is still there. And the only question to ask is simple. What are you going to do while it's still available? Not today, not someday, but now. With the accounting complete, with clear eyes on what's settled and what isn't, with no remaining story about drift or circumstance or not quite having seen it clearly enough. This Act 4 is where a man decides what he does with all of that. Not what he intends, but what he does. So I want you to stay with it, because the Band of Brothers is where men stop carrying the weight of this alone and start doing something with it alongside other men who are in the same reckoning. And if you're ready for that, go to therevolutionaryman.com/Band of Brothers. Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. The cost of staying asleep doesn't wait for you to be ready. Take the Integrity Mirror. It's a 15-minute assessment that shows you exactly which man you've become and what it's costing you. Go to therevolutionaryman.com/The Mirror.